Kim Tae-ho sat in his small patrol ship watching the stars through the cockpit window. His ship was not big or fancy, but it was fast and quiet enough for his patrol route. The Earth Defense Force had given him this job 3 years ago after he left the Special Forces. They trusted him to watch the edges of human space and report any trouble. Today something felt wrong. He could not explain why, but his old soldier training was telling him danger was near. The empty space around him looked peaceful, but Tae-ho had learned to trust his gut feelings. They had kept him alive during many dangerous missions when he wore the uniform. His hand moved to touch the metal tag hanging around his neck. The old dog tag was scratched and worn from years of use. It had his name, rank, and service number stamped into the metal. Along with these was a special symbol that most people would not recognize. But Tae-ho remembered every mission, every battle, every friend he had lost while serving in that unit. The radar screen stayed empty, showing no ships or signals anywhere near his position. But the bad feeling would not go away. Something was definitely wrong, even though he could not see what it was. Tae-ho checked his weapons and made sure his emergency signal was working properly. Then the space around him suddenly filled with bright lights. Huge alien ships appeared from nowhere surrounding his tiny patrol craft. They were massive gray metal monsters covered in weapons and thick armor. Plating Tae-ho had never seen ships like these before, but he knew right away they were not made by humans. The designs were all wrong, with too many sharp angles and strange symbols painted on their sides. A voice came through his radio speaking. In broken human language, the accent was thick and the words were wrong, but the meaning was clear. These aliens wanted him to surrender his ship immediately, or they would blow it apart with their weapons. Tae-ho looked at his control systems. His little patrol ship had no chance against these huge war machines. He was outnumbered 20-1, and his small weapons could not even scratch their heavy armor. But giving up without a fight went against everything the Special Forces had taught him. He turned on his emergency beacon and sent out a distress call. Maybe other human ships would hear it and know what happened to him. Then he powered up his weapons and got ready to fight, even though he knew it was hopeless. The alien ships fired some kind of energy beam that made all his controls stop working. His engines went dead and his weapons shut down. Even the lights turned off, leaving him sitting in complete darkness. These aliens had technology that could disable human systems without destroying the ship itself. A huge metal claw reached out and grabbed his patrol craft, pulling it inside one of the alien vessels. Tae-ho sat in his pilot's seat, waiting to see what would happen next. The dog tag felt heavy around his neck as he thought about his old teammates from the Special Forces. They would have found some way to keep fighting even in this impossible situation. The airlock opened with a loud hissing sound, and bright lights flooded into his ship. Several tall, gray figures walked inside wearing thick armor. They had 4 arms each, and their faces looked like they were carved from stone. Their yellow eyes glowed in the darkness, and they moved like careful hunters. One of them pointed a strange weapon at Tae-ho and spoke through some kind of translator device. The mechanical voice was flat, but the words were clear enough. They wanted him to come out slowly with his hands where they could see them. Any quick movements would mean immediate death. Tae-ho stood up carefully and walked out of his ship. The aliens were even bigger up close, towering over him like giants. Their skin was rough like leather and their hands ended in sharp claws. These were clearly warriors built for fighting and conquest. They searched him roughly, taking away his sidearm and communication equipment, but they left the dog tag around his neck. Maybe they thought it was just jewelry, or maybe they did not care about a piece of old scratched metal. Tae-ho did not tell them. They were wrong. The leader studied him with those glowing yellow eyes. He said something to the others in their grinding metal language. Then he turned back to Tae-ho and used the translator again. He explained that Tae-ho was now property of something called the Vorten Empire. He would be taken to their capital world and forced to fight in gladiatorial arenas for the entertainment of their people. Most humans lasted less than 1 minute in the arena before being killed by various creatures and warriors. They dragged him through metal corridors filled with other prisoners from many different worlds. Tae-ho saw tall, thin beings that looked like walking sticks. Some were short and covered in thick fur. Others had scales or feathers instead of skin. All of them had the same hopeless, defeated look in their eyes. The prison area was one large room filled with metal cages. Each cage held several prisoners packed together like animals being transported to market. The smell was terrible, and the dim lighting made everything look gray and depressing. Guards walked back and forth carrying energy weapons and watching for trouble. They threw Tae-ho into a cage with 3 other beings. One looked like a large bird with bright blue feathers and intelligent dark eyes. Another was covered in green scales and had a long, thick tail. The 3rd prisoner was small and gray, with large ears that kept twitching nervously. The bird creature spoke first, using a universal translator that each cage seemed to have. His name was Kor, and he had been captured when the Vorthons destroyed his homeworld. The scaled being called himself Vex, and said he had been a soldier before being taken prisoner. The small gray one just shook his head sadly when, asked about his background, Kor explained how the gladiatorial arena worked. Prisoners were forced to fight dangerous wild animals or skilled Vorthon warriors, while millions of spectators watched for entertainment. The crowds loved seeing different species struggle and die in creative ways. Very few prisoners survived more than 1 or 2 fights before being killed. But something about Tae-ho puzzled the other prisoners. Most new arrivals were terrified and spent their time crying or begging. The guards for mercy Tae-ho just sat quietly listening to their explanations and asking questions about guard schedules and arena layouts. He treated their terrible situation like it was a military planning meeting. Vex asked why he was not afraid. Like everyone else, Tae-ho touched his dog tag and smiled slightly. He explained that being captured was sometimes just part of a mission. A good soldier always looked for ways to complete objectives, no matter what the circumstances were. The other prisoners looked at each other in confusion. What kind of objective could this human possibly have in a place like this? But there was something about his calm confidence that made them feel a tiny bit of hope for the first time in many months. Outside their cage, the Vorthon guards continued walking their regular patrols. They had no idea they had just captured something far more dangerous than an ordinary human patrol pilot. The dog tag around Tae-ho's neck held secrets that would soon change everything. The trip to Vorth Prime took 10 long days in the belly of the alien transport ship. During this time, Tae-ho learned everything he could from his fellow prisoners. Each alien species had different strengths and weaknesses that the Vorthons used against them in the fighting arenas. Kor told him about the various types of arena battles. Sometimes prisoners had to fight wild beasts brought from deadly worlds. Other times they faced trained Vorthon warriors who treated the fights like sporting events. The worst battles forced prisoners from different species to kill each other while the crowds cheered. Vex explained how the arena ranking system worked. New prisoners started at the bottom level, where they were considered expendable entertainment. If somehow they survived a few fights and made the crowd happy, they might get slightly better treatment. The best fighters received private cells, decent food, and medical care between battles. But most prisoners never lived through their first fight. Small Gray, being named Nim, finally started talking on the 8th day. He had been in the arena for almost a whole year. He survived by being too small and quick for most opponents to catch easily. But he warned Tae-ho that humans were considered the weakest fighters in the entire galaxy. According to Vorthon military records, humans had no natural weapons like claws or fangs. They had no thick skin or armor plating for protection. They were not especially fast or strong compared to other alien species. Their only advantage was supposed to be intelligence, but even that was considered poor compared to races like Nim's people. Most humans died in the arena from pure terror before any real fighting even started. Those who tried to fight usually froze up when faced with actual danger. It was pathetic how quickly they gave up hope and accepted death. Tae-ho listened to all this information without showing any emotion on his face. He asked detailed questions about arena layouts, weapon availability, guard procedures, and crowd behavior patterns. The other prisoners thought he was planning some impossible escape attempt. They did not understand that he was simply gathering intelligence like any good soldier would do. When the transport ship finally reached Vorth Prime, the prisoners got their first look at the capital world through small windows. The entire planet was covered in massive cities that stretched up into the clouds. Everything was built from gray metal and sharp angles that hurt to look at for very long. The gladiatorial complex sat in the center of the biggest city, like a huge metal mountain. It was so enormous that entire districts were built around it, just to serve the arena. Millions of Vorthons lived and worked, just to support the endless need for violent entertainment. Processing all the new prisoners took most of a day. Vorthon medical technicians scanned each being with various devices to record their physical abilities and health status. They wanted to make sure each prisoner would provide good entertainment value before dying in the fights. A Vorthon doctor examined Tai-Ho with special interest. Humans were rare in this part of space, and the doctor had never seen one up close before. He measured Tai-Ho's reflexes, strength, and stamina while taking detailed notes on an electronic tablet. The results seemed to disappoint him greatly. The doctor told his assistants that this human was even weaker than their computer records suggested. His muscle density was low. His bone structure was fragile, and his heart and lungs were barely adequate. He would probably collapse from exhaustion before any serious fighting could happen. They assigned Tai-Ho to Block 7, which housed the lowest quality prisoners. These were beings considered only good for feeding to dangerous animals or serving as moving targets for Vorthon warriors to practice on. The average life expectancy in Block 7 was measured in days rather than weeks or months. His new cell was slightly bigger than the transport ship prison, but not by much. He shared it with 6 other prisoners, including Kor and Vex, who had also been judged worthless for anything except quick death. The sleeping mats were thin, and there was only one waste disposal unit for everyone. Block 7 was supervised by a massive Vorthon guard named Krex. He had deep scars covering his arms and face from years of arena fighting before becoming a prison supervisor. Krex especially enjoyed tormenting the smaller, weaker prisoners like humans on Tai-Ho's first day. Krex came to his cell specifically to look at the new human fighter. He laughed loudly when he saw how small and fragile Tai-Ho appeared compared to the other prisoners. Through his translator device, he explained that humans typically provided less than 30 seconds of entertainment before dying horribly. Most human prisoners spent their final hours crying and begging for mercy, Krex said with obvious enjoyment. Some actually died of heart failure before even entering the arena. The few who tried to fight usually froze up completely when faced with real danger. It was almost boring how quickly they gave up. Tai-Ho listened politely to this information, then asked about the arena safety procedures. What happened if a prisoner was injured but not killed right away? Were there medical facilities available? How did the weapon selection process work? Were prisoners allowed to watch other fights before their own turn guard? Krex stared at him in complete confusion. Most prisoners asked about escape routes or begged for better food and treatment. This human was asking questions like he actually planned to survive and win battles in the arena. It was almost insulting to suggest that such a weak creature could last more than a few seconds. The guard explained that there were no safety procedures because prisoners were not expected to live through their fights. Medical treatment was only given to valuable fighters who earned it through multiple victories. Weapons were basic and chosen based on what kind of entertainment the crowd wanted to see that day. As for watching other fights, that was completely forbidden for new prisoners. The arena masters wanted each fighter to face unknown situations without any preparation. Fear and confusion made for much better entertainment than skilled tactical fighting, but Tai-Ho had already learned everything he needed to know. The arena followed predictable patterns and procedures. The guards had routine schedules they followed. Most importantly, the Vorthons completely underestimated what humans were actually capable of when properly motivated and trained. That night after the lights went out, Kor whispered, asking what Tai-Ho was really thinking. The human seemed too calm and confident for someone facing certain death in just a few days. Was he planning some kind of suicide attack to kill a few Vorthons before dying? Tai-Ho touched his dog tag in the darkness. He told them quietly that every mission had objectives that went beyond just personal survival. Sometimes the best way to complete those objectives was to exceed enemy expectations. The Vorthons thought they knew what humans could do, but their information was very incomplete. Vex asked what possible objective he could have in this hopeless place. They were prisoners in the most secure facility in the Empire, surrounded by guards, cameras, and weapon systems. Even if he somehow won a few arena fights, he would still be trapped until he eventually lost and died. Tejo smiled in the darkness. He explained that objectives were not always about escape or immediate victory. Sometimes the most important thing was sending a message or proving a point. Sometimes showing others what was possible mattered more than individual survival. The other prisoners did not fully understand what he meant, but something in his calm voice made them feel different about their situation. For the first time, in many months, they began to wonder if there might be more to this human than anyone realized. Outside their cell, the massive arena complex continued its nightly routines. Guards walked their scheduled patrols. Maintenance crews cleaned the fighting areas. Arena masters planned the next day's bloody entertainment. None of them had any idea they were about to witness something that would change everything they thought they knew about human capabilities. The morning of Tejo's first arena fight arrived with the thunderous sound of millions of Vorthans filling the enormous stadium. The noise was incredible, like continuous thunder rolling across the sky. Through small windows in Block 7, the prisoners could see endless crowds streaming into their seats, eager to watch Blood and Death Guard Krex arrived at the cell with 2 other guards carrying a set of basic fighting equipment. The gear was deliberately poor quality, designed to make fights more entertaining rather than giving prisoners any real chance of survival. There was a simple leather vest, some worn arm guards, and a short sword that had seen much better days. The guards dragged Tejo through a maze of corridors toward the arena entrance. Other prisoners pressed against their cell bars to watch him leave. Most looked at him with pity, knowing they would never see him alive again. A few whispered words of encouragement, but their voices sounded hollow and hopeless. Preparation area beneath the arena was like a slaughterhouse. There were holding cells for dangerous creatures that would be used in fights, mechanical equipment for moving heavy objects into the fighting area, medical stations where only the most valuable fighters received treatment between battles. Arena technicians strapped the leather armor onto Tejo and handed him the old sword. One of them laughed and said the weapon was probably too heavy for such a weak human to lift properly. They made bets among themselves about how quickly he would drop it and try to run away. Through the bars of his holding cell, Tejo could see into the arena itself. It was absolutely enormous, with sandy floors and high walls topped by energy force fields to protect the spectators. The seating areas rose up in countless tiers until they disappeared into the distance. Every single seat seemed filled with gray-skinned Vorthans hungry for violent entertainment. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena, introducing the day's bloody events. His words were translated through speakers, so all the different alien species could understand. Today's opening fight would feature a new human prisoner against a razor beast from the death world of Karnax. Crowd roared its approval with deafening noise. Razor beasts were very popular because they killed their prey in spectacular fashion. They had 6 legs for incredible speed and claws made of crystal material that could cut through almost anything. Their hunting instincts were perfect, and they never showed mercy to wounded opponents. A gate opened on the far side of the arena, and the razor beast bounded onto the sand. It was about the size of a large wolf, but moved like liquid lightning. Its razor-sharp claws caught the artificial sunlight and threw rainbow patterns across the arena floor. The crowd cheered even louder when they saw how magnificent and deadly the creature looked. Tejo's gate opened, and he walked calmly into the arena. The noise from 60 million spectators was absolutely deafening, but he ignored it completely. He had performed dangerous missions in front of hostile audiences before during his Special Forces service. The key was focusing on the objective and blocking out everything else. The razor beast noticed him immediately and began moving in a wide hunting circle. Its predator instincts told it to study the prey first, before attacking to find weaknesses and plan the perfect killing strike. Most arena opponents either charged forward blindly or cowered in terror at this point. But Tejo did neither of these things. Instead, he moved to the center of the fighting area and began his own tactical assessment. He studied the beast's movement, patterns, the condition of the sand under his feet, and the layout of the arena space. His military training had taught him to gather intelligence even during active combat. The crowd grew restless, waiting for violent action. They had come to see quick, brutal death, not a careful tactical analysis. The announcer tried to build excitement by describing the razor beast's previous kills and pointing out the human's obvious terror. But Tae-ho showed absolutely no signs of fear. He held his sword with proper technique and moved with the controlled grace of someone who had been trained extensively in combat. The razor beast seemed confused by this behavior, since most prey species panicked immediately when facing a deadly predator. Finally, the creature decided to attack. It launched itself forward with incredible speed, covering half the arena distance in just 2 powerful leaps. Its crystal claws extended fully, and its mouth open, showing multiple rows of razor-sharp teeth. The entire crowd held its breath, expecting to see the human torn apart in seconds. Tae-ho waited until the very last possible moment, then moved. Not backward in retreat, but sideways in a perfectly timed dodge that used the beast's own momentum against it. As the creature flew past him, he brought his sword down in a precise cutting motion that opened a shallow wound along its flank. The massive crowd gasped in complete surprise. No one had expected the weak human to actually hurt the dangerous beast. On their first exchange, the razor beast spun around, snarling in pain and confusion. Its simple hunting brain could not understand how such weak-looking prey had managed to wound it. The second attack was much more cautious. The beast circled closer, testing with quick swipes of its deadly claws. Each time, Tae-ho moved just enough to avoid serious damage while looking for opportunities to counterattack. He was fighting intelligently, using the creature's natural aggression against itself. This was not how arena fights were supposed to go at all. The crowd expected either instant death or desperate, panicked struggling from doomed prisoners. They did not expect to see actual skilled tactical combat from someone who clearly knew exactly what he was doing. The fight continued for several long minutes, with both combatants becoming more careful and respectful of each other. The razor beast had learned that this human was genuinely dangerous despite his small appearance. Tae-ho had learned the creature's attack patterns, timing, and vulnerable spots. Now it became a test of endurance, skill, and determination. The crowd was getting excited in a completely different way now. Instead of bloodthirsty cheers for quick death, they were making sounds that showed genuine interest in a real contest. Some of them had never seen a human fight before and were amazed by what they were witnessing. The decisive moment came when the razor beast tried a complex new attack pattern. It feinted, with its front claws, then spun around to strike with its powerful rear legs. The combination move was perfectly executed and should have caught any normal opponent completely off guard. But Tae-ho had been watching and waiting for exactly this kind of advanced attack. As the beast began its spinning motion, he stepped inside its turning radius and drove his sword deep into the vulnerable spot where the creature's neck met its muscular shoulder. The blade found the major blood vessel, and the fight was suddenly over. The razor beast collapsed onto the sandy arena floor, twitching once before going completely still. Tae-ho pulled his sword free and stepped back, breathing hard, but clearly victorious. The entire arena fell into absolute silence, as 60 million Vorthons tried to process what they had just seen happen. Then the crowd absolutely exploded. Not with disappointment or anger, but with genuine excitement and approval. They had expected to see a quick, boring execution, but instead had witnessed a real fight between skilled opponents. The human had not just survived, but had won convincingly against a deadly predator. The announcer struggled to find words to describe what had just happened. Human prisoners were supposed to die, quickly and pathetically, in the arena. They were not supposed to display combat skills that impressed even trained Vorthon military observers in the crowd. As Tae-ho walked back toward his exit gate, the crowd began chanting something in their own language. The translation came through the speakers as words meaning worthy opponent or honored fighter. These were titles normally reserved only for the most skilled gladiators in the entire empire. Back in the preparation area, the arena staff stared at him with new respect mixed with complete confusion. No one knew how to handle a human who had not only survived his first fight, but had put on a genuinely entertaining show. The normal procedures were designed for prisoners who lasted 30 seconds, not 7 full minutes. They gave him water and basic medical attention for the minor cuts he had received during the battle. His leather armor was barely damaged, and his sword was still sharp enough for future use. Everything about his condition suggested someone who expected to fight again, rather than someone who had barely escaped death. As the guards led him back toward Block 7, Word of his incredible victory was already spreading throughout the entire prison complex. Other prisoners, who had watched the fight through small viewing screens, were talking excitedly about the human who had actually defeated a razor beast in single combat. When Tae-ho finally reached his cell, Kor and Vex crowded around him with dozens of questions. How had he moved so quickly and precisely? Where had he learned to fight with such skill? Most importantly, did he think he could do it again against different types of opponents? Tae-ho sat down on his thin sleeping mat and touched his dog tag gently. He told them that the fight had gone exactly according to his plan. The beast was dangerous, but also predictable. More importantly, he had sent a clear message to everyone watching, that humans were definitely not as weak as they appeared. The other prisoners looked at him with something approaching awe and respect. For the first time since their capture, they had seen one of their own, not just survive but actually win against the empires. News of the humans' shocking victory spread through the Vorthan Empire much faster than anyone expected. Within just hours of the arena fight, video recordings were being sent to military bases and government offices across dozens of worlds. What had seemed like simple entertainment had suddenly become something much more important and concerning. Colonel Vex of the Vorthan Intelligence Division received the combat footage at his office on the military moon of Car 7. He had been watching human activities closely since the end of the Conquest Wars 3 years earlier. His job was looking for signs of organized resistance or new technology among the defeated human colonies. The colonel watched the arena battle 3 complete times before calling his expert analysis team. Something about the humans' fighting techniques bothered him in ways he could not immediately understand. The movements were too precise, too calculated for an ordinary patrol ship pilot. This looked exactly like someone with extensive advanced military training. His team ran the video through special combat analysis computers that compared fighting styles across thousands of different species and military organizations. The results were very concerning. The humans' movement patterns matched elite special operations training rather than basic defense force procedures. But what really caught Colonel Vex's attention was a brief moment when the human touched something at his neck between exchanges with the razor beast. The gesture was quick and almost unconscious, but it suggested some kind of personal identification marker or military talisman. The colonel immediately ordered a detailed medical scan of the human prisoner using the arena's advanced equipment. He wanted to know everything about this individual, including any devices or markings that might indicate special military status. The scan would be done under the excuse of routine medical evaluation after combat the next day. Tae-ho was taken from his cell to the arena medical facility. The Vorthan technicians told him this was standard procedure after a successful fight to make sure he stayed healthy enough for future entertainment. They connected him to various scanning devices and began taking very detailed readings of his entire body. The metal detector found the dog tag immediately. When the technicians examined it more closely, they realized it was not just decorative jewelry. The tag contained specific markings, serial numbers, and unit designations that clearly indicated military service. More importantly, it bore a special symbol that meant something significant. Colonel Vex arrived at the arena complex within hours of receiving the scan results he brought. With him a team of military intelligence specialists and access to classified databases containing detailed information about human special forces units. What they discovered in those files made the colonel feel cold fear. The dog tag belonged to the 707th Special Mission Battalion, also known by their nickname, the Ghost Tigers. This was one of the most elite and dangerous special operations units in all of human military history. During the Conquest Wars, they had been responsible for some of the most devastating and impossible attacks against Vorthan forces. The Ghost Tigers specialized in deep infiltration missions far behind enemy lines. They could somehow slip past security systems that should have been completely impossible to breach. They eliminated high-value targets with surgical precision, then disappeared without leaving any useful trace of their presence or methods. Colonel Vex personally remembered 3 separate incidents where Ghost Tiger operatives had penetrated supposedly secure facilities. In one case, they had completely destroyed an entire command ship by infiltrating the heavily guarded engine room. In another operation, they had assassinated a fleet admiral in his private quarters while surrounded by elite guards. The most terrifying incident involved the sabotage of the orbital defense platform protecting the Vorthan homeworld itself. The ghost tigers had somehow gotten inside the facility and planted explosives that made the destruction look like an accidental system malfunction. Only much later, investigation revealed the sophisticated infiltration that had made it possible. The 707th Unit had been declared completely destroyed during the final battles for Earth's surrender intelligence. Reports stated that all members had either been killed in action or died during the nuclear bombardment of their secret training facilities. Apparently, those reports had been completely wrong. Colonel Vex immediately put maximum security protocols into effect throughout the entire arena complex. Every single human prisoner was subjected to intensive scanning and interrogation. Security cameras were doubled, and guard patrols were increased to constant coverage. Electronic surveillance systems went to full alert status, but the damage might already be done. If one Ghost Tiger operative had been captured alive and was now in their custody, how many others might still be active somewhere? Were there resistance cells operating throughout human space? Had this prisoner's capture been completely intentional as part of some larger, more dangerous operation? The Vorthan High Command was notified within hours of the discovery. Emergency meetings were called to discuss the serious implications of having a Ghost Tiger operative in Imperial custody. Some officials wanted him executed immediately to prevent any possible escape attempt or rescue operation. Others argued that he represented an extremely valuable intelligence asset who could provide critical information about remaining human military capabilities. A living Ghost Tiger could tell them about hidden bases, supply routes, weapons caches, and the identities of other resistance fighters still at large, while the High Command debated what to do. Taiho remained in his cell completely unaware that his true identity had been discovered. He spent his time talking with other prisoners and learning more about the arena complex's daily routines and security measures. To outside observers, he appeared to be just another fighter preparing for his next battle. But word of his amazing victory had spread far beyond just the arena staff and spectators. Throughout the prison complex and even into the general population of Vorth, other conquered species were talking about the human who had fought like a legendary warrior from their own ancient stories. The bird people had old tales about small fighters who could defeat much larger opponents through pure skill and determination. The scaled races spoke of ancient heroes who refused to surrender even when facing completely impossible odds. The various mammalian species shared stories of underdogs who inspired entire populations to resist oppression. Nim, the small gray prisoner who had somehow survived almost a full year in the arena, came to Taiho's cell with an unusual request. He wanted to know if the human could teach some basic fighting techniques to other prisoners, not necessarily to help them win their battles, but to help them die with dignity instead of terror. Taiho considered this request very carefully. Teaching combat skills could easily be seen as organizing resistance activities which would bring down severe punishment from the guards. But helping fellow prisoners defend themselves was also a basic moral obligation that he could not ignore. He began with very simple lessons during the daily exercise periods. How to move efficiently to conserve precious energy. How to read an opponent's body language to predict their attacks. How to use natural fear as motivation rather than letting it cause paralysis. The techniques were basic, but they gave prisoners something constructive to focus on. The changes started small. At first, prisoners in Block 7 stopped cowering automatically when guards walked by their cells. They stood straighter and made direct eye contact more often. Their conversations became less focused on despair and more focused on practical survival, tactics, and techniques. Other cell blocks began requesting similar informal training sessions. Word spread quickly through the prison community that the human was teaching warriors from different species how to fight more effectively. The lessons were always presented as preparation for arena combat rather than resistance against the guards. But Colonel Vex's surveillance team noticed the behavioral changes immediately. Prisoners were becoming noticeably more organized and confident in their actions. They were sharing information between species groups that had never cooperated before. Most concerning of all, they were looking to the human as some kind of leader or inspiration. The colonel realized that keeping the Ghost Tiger operative alive might actually be far more dangerous than executing him immediately. Even while held in captivity, he was having a powerful effect on the conquered populations that could lead to very serious problems for Imperial control. Emergency isolation. Protocols were quickly implemented to separate Taeho from all other prisoners. He was moved to a maximum security cell in the restricted section, where only the most dangerous gladiators were normally housed. All contact with other prisoners was completely forbidden, and his every movement was constantly monitored, but it was already too late to contain what had been started. The other prisoners had seen what was possible when someone refused to accept defeat. They had learned that humans were definitely not as weak as the Empire claimed. Most importantly, they had begun to believe that organized resistance might not be completely hopeless. After all, as Taeho sat in his new isolation cell, he touched his old dog tag and smiled slightly. The mission was progressing exactly as any proper Ghost Tiger operation should. He had successfully infiltrated the target facility, assessed the tactical situation, and begun the delicate process of. The Vorthon High Command's response was swift, brutal, and complete. Within 24 hours of discovering Taeho's true identity, massive security operations began across Fourth Prime and dozens of other worlds. Every human in the Empire became a potential suspect who needed to be investigated and cleared of any special forces connections. Admiral Krex, the Supreme Military Commander, issued emergency orders that sent shockwaves through the entire Imperial government. All human prisoners in gladiatorial complexes were to be immediately isolated and subjected to intensive interrogation using advanced techniques. Any human showing unusual combat skills or leadership qualities was to be terminated without trial or delay. Colonel Vex suddenly found himself in charge of the largest counterintelligence operation in all of Vorthon history. His teams were deployed to every major population center where humans lived or worked as slaves. They had complete authority to detain, question, torture, and execute anyone suspected of resistance activities. The paranoia spreading through the Empire was not without good reason. During the Conquest Wars, Ghost Tiger operatives had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to appear exactly where they were least expected. They struck at targets that should have been completely impossible to reach, then vanished without leaving any useful evidence behind. One incident that still haunted Vorthon military leaders involved the assassination of Fleet Commander Jex during a secure strategy planning meeting. The Ghost Tigers had somehow infiltrated the heavily guarded command ship, bypassed multiple security checkpoints, and eliminated their target in a room full of armed elite officers. Another terrifying operation had resulted in the complete destruction of the orbital defense platform that protected the Vorthon homeworld itself. The sabotage had been so precisely executed that it initially looked like a routine system malfunction, rather than enemy action. Only detailed later investigation revealed the sophisticated infiltration that had made such destruction possible. Now the Empire faced the absolutely terrifying possibility that those devastating operations had been just the beginning. If Ghost Tiger units were still active and operational, they could be planning strikes against critical infrastructure facilities or high-value government personnel. The entire Imperial power structure could be under serious threat from enemies they could not see, predict, or catch. At the arena complex, security measures were increased to levels normally reserved for active wartime military facilities. Every single prisoner was searched multiple times per day using advanced detection equipment. All conversations were monitored by sophisticated surveillance systems. Guard rotations were completely randomized to prevent prisoners from establishing any predictable patterns. But despite this massive security response, strange incidents began happening throughout the complex and far beyond small acts of defiance that had been completely unthinkable. Just weeks earlier, started occurring with increasing frequency and coordination. In the work areas where prisoners performed maintenance tasks, important tools began disappearing in ways that could not be explained by normal theft or carelessness. Security cameras malfunctioned at critical moments, allowing unauthorized movement between restricted sections. Guard duty schedules became mysteriously confused, resulting in dangerous gaps in coverage that prisoners somehow knew about and exploited. The problems were definitely not limited to just the arena complex. Across the entire planet of Vorth Prime, the various, conquered populations began displaying subtle but unmistakable signs of organized resistance. Work efficiency in the massive factory complexes decreased significantly as alien workers found creative ways to slow production without triggering automatic disciplinary systems. Transportation networks experienced mysterious delays and mechanical breakdowns that created serious chaos in the carefully organized Imperial logistics systems. Communication relays suffered technical problems that disrupted coordination between different government departments and military units. Each individual incident was relatively minor and could easily be explained as normal system failures or simple worker incompetence. But when examined together, they represented a clear pattern of coordinated resistance that suggested very careful planning and organization by someone who understood Imperial systems. Colonel Vex realized with growing alarm that the Ghost Tiger operative in maximum security isolation had somehow managed to inspire and coordinate this spreading resistance despite being held under constant surveillance. The techniques being used were classic Special Forces tactics, perfectly adapted for civilian populations. The Empire's best interrogation specialists were brought in to question Teho using the most advanced psychological pressure techniques available to Vorthan science. They used powerful drugs that were supposed to make lying completely impossible. They employed refined torture, methods that had broken the strongest alien warriors from a dozen different worlds. But Teho had been extensively trained to resist exactly these kinds of enhanced interrogation techniques. His Ghost Tiger conditioning included months of preparation for capture and interrogation scenarios designed by experts who understood enemy methods. He gave his interrogators absolutely nothing useful while maintaining a convincing appearance of cooperation when asked about other Ghost Tiger operatives. Still at large, he provided detailed information about unit members who had been confirmed dead during the final battles. When pressed about resistance networks and hidden bases, he described fictional organizations based on military training exercises, rather than any real operations or locations. The frustrated interrogators became increasingly desperate as their intensive sessions produced intelligence reports that looked comprehensive and detailed, but contained absolutely nothing actionable or useful. They were dealing with someone who understood their methods far better than they understood his capabilities and training. Meanwhile, the resistance activities continued to spread and grow more sophisticated across the Empire. What had started as minor workplace disruptions slowly evolved into more complex operations that targeted critical Imperial infrastructure and command systems. Power distribution networks began experiencing coordinated failures that left entire districts without electricity for hours at a time. Water treatment facilities suffered mysterious contamination problems that forced emergency shutdowns. Communication satellites developed technical glitches that interrupted military coordination across multiple star systems. The most alarming development was how different conquered species were beginning to work together. For the first time in decades, bird people shared intelligence with scaled races who coordinated with mammalian workers to create maximum disruption. The various alien populations had never cooperated like this before during centuries of Imperial rule. Vorthan security forces found themselves fighting dozens of small problems simultaneously, instead of one large obvious threat. Their standard tactics were designed for crushing organized military resistance, not dealing with widespread civilian disobedience coordinated by invisible leadership. Colonel Vex studied reports from across the Empire and saw a pattern that chilled him to the bone. The resistance activities were following classic Ghost Tiger operational methods. Small cells working independently toward common objectives. No central command structure that could be destroyed or captured. Maximum psychological impact with minimum resources. More disturbing was how the legend of the human arena fighter was spreading beyond Vorth Prime itself. Other worlds were hearing stories about the warrior who had defeated a razor beast and inspired hope among the conquered peoples. The tale was growing, with each telling becoming a symbol of resistance against Imperial oppression. On the mining world of Keth 9, human workers began refusing overtime assignments that exceeded safety regulations. On the agricultural planet Zor 12, alien farmers started delivering food shipments that were exactly on schedule, but somehow always slightly smaller than ordered. The shortages were never large enough to trigger investigations, but they added up over time. Most concerning of all were reports from military installations where conquered species worked as support personnel. Weapons maintenance schedules began experiencing delays. Equipment inspections revealed problems that had never been noticed before. Supply requisitions contained small errors that caused significant logistical complications. The Empire's response grew increasingly desperate and brutal. Mass arrests began on worlds where resistance activities were detected. Entire districts were placed under martial law with strict curfews and movement restrictions. Public executions were staged to terrorize populations back into complete submission. But the harder the Empire cracked down, the more the resistance seemed to spread. Martyrs created by public executions became new symbols for other conquered peoples to rally around fear. Tactics that had worked for centuries were somehow losing their effectiveness. Colonel Vex realized that the Ghost Tiger operative had achieved something unprecedented in Imperial history. He had given the conquered species something they had never possessed before: a shared identity and common cause that transcended their individual worlds and cultures. The various alien races had always been too different and scattered to unite against their oppressors, but now they had a human warrior whose victory proved that the Empire was not invincible. His example showed that resistance. 6 months after Tejo's capture, Vorth Prime experienced something it had never seen in centuries of Imperial rule. A coordinated uprising that shook the very foundations of Vorthan power. The humans' presence in the arena had been the spark, but the fuel for rebellion had been building for decades among the conquered peoples. His example of refusing to submit, of fighting with honor and skill despite impossible odds, had ignited something deep in the hearts of billions of oppressed beings across the Empire. They had watched a single human prove that the Vorthans were not invincible, and that resistance could succeed with proper planning and courage. The uprising began in the gladiatorial complex itself, where alien fighters who had learned to work together through Tejo's teachings overwhelmed their guards and seized control of the facility. But this dramatic action was just the opening move in a much larger coordinated plan. Across Vorth Prime, the conquered peoples rose up simultaneously in dozens of locations. They had secretly coordinated their efforts through a network of resistance cells that had formed around the growing legend of the human warrior. The various species that had never been able to cooperate before were now working together with deadly efficiency. The Vorthan military found itself fighting on hundreds of fronts at once, their forces scattered and confused by the incredible scope and perfect timing of the rebellion. Their intelligence networks, which had been so effective against conventional military threats, had completely failed to detect the resistance movement growing right under their noses. The gladiatorial system that the Empire had used to crush the spirits of conquered peoples had instead become a training ground where different species learned to trust each other and fight as unified teams. The arena masters had unknowingly created exactly the kind of cooperation they had always feared most. In the first hour of the uprising, key infrastructure targets across the planet were hit simultaneously. Power plants, transportation hubs, communication centers, and weapons depots all suffered coordinated attacks that suggested months of careful planning and reconnaissance. The attacks were not random acts of violence, but precisely executed operations that targeted specific systems to maximize disruption while minimizing civilian casualties. This surgical approach showed the influence of military thinking that could only have come from special forces training. Colonel Vex found himself trapped in his command center as reports flooded in from across the planet. Every major city was experiencing simultaneous uprisings. The conquered populations were using their intimate knowledge of Imperial systems to strike at the most vulnerable points. The resistance fighters moved with coordination that should have been impossible for such diverse species. They communicated through systems the Vorthans did not even know existed and struck at targets using insider knowledge that suggested years of preparation. Most shocking of all was how the various alien races were working together as if they had been allies for generations. Bird people provided aerial reconnaissance, while scaled races handled heavy combat and small, quick species carried out infiltration missions. The cooperation was flawless. The Empire's response was hampered by decades of overconfidence in their own superiority. Vorthan commanders had never prepared for the possibility of organized resistance from conquered peoples. They had always assumed that fear and overwhelming force would be enough to maintain control forever. Emergency reinforcements were called in from other worlds, but the transportation systems were under attack and communication networks were disrupted. Vorthon forces that should have been able to coordinate their response found themselves fighting isolated battles without proper support in the arena complex itself. The freed prisoners had turned the facility into a fortress. They used their knowledge of the building's layout and security systems to create an impregnable defensive position. The same cameras and sensors that had once watched them were now being used to monitor Vorthon troop movements. T-Ho was freed from his maximum security cell by a mixed team of former gladiators led by Kor and Vex. They had fought their way through multiple security checkpoints using tactics that combined the natural abilities of different species with coordinated team strategies. When they reached his cell, T-Ho was ready. He had spent months observing guard routines and memorizing facility layouts through careful listening and questioning. His isolation had not prevented him from gathering the intelligence needed to plan an escape route. The reunion with his fellow prisoners was brief but emotional. They looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and awe, understanding that his example had made all of this possible. Without his demonstration that resistance could succeed, none of them would have had the courage to fight back. But T-Ho knew that the real work was just beginning. Taking control of the arena was only the first step in a much larger operation. The goal was not just escape, but the complete liberation of all conquered peoples across the Vorthon Empire. Using the arena's communication systems, he broadcast a message to resistance cells across the galaxy. The transmission was brief, but powerful. He identified himself by unit designation and confirmed that organized human military forces were still active and fighting. The message sent shockwaves through the Empire as Vorthon intelligence officers realized their worst fears had been confirmed. The Ghost Tigers were not extinct and had been planning this operation for months or possibly years. The capture of their operative had been part of the plan all along. Across dozens of worlds, similar uprisings began as local. Resistance cells received the signal they had been waiting for. The conquered peoples had been organizing in secret, using the gladiatorial networks and entertainment systems to coordinate their efforts. The empire that had seemed invincible just hours earlier was now fighting for its survival on multiple fronts. The Vorthon military, which had grown soft from centuries of easy victories, found itself completely unprepared for coordinated resistance from determined opponents. On Vorth Prime, the battle raged for 3 days as Imperial forces tried desperately to regain control of their capital world. But the uprising had been too well planned, and the resistance fighters knew the terrain better than the professional soldiers sent to stop them. The turning point came when resistance forces captured the planetary communication center and began broadcasting footage of their victories across the Empire. Conquered peoples on other worlds saw Vorthons being defeated by fighters they had dismissed as weak and worthless. The psychological impact was devastating to Imperial morale. Vorthon soldiers who had never faced serious opposition suddenly found themselves fighting enemies who refused to surrender or retreat. The conquered species that had seemed broken and hopeless were now displaying courage and skill that matched their oppressors as smoke rose from burning government buildings across Vorth Prime. T-Ho stood in the ruins of the gladiatorial complex surrounded by former prisoners from dozens of different worlds. They were working together to coordinate evacuation of civilians and establishment of secure positions. The Korean Special Forces operator was still wearing his old dog tag, but now it meant something different to the beings around him. It was no longer just a piece of military identification, but a symbol of hope and resistance that had inspired an entire galaxy to fight for freedom. He had never intended to start a revolution when he was captured. 6 months earlier, his mission had simply been to patrol the edges of human space and report any problems. But sometimes the most effective operations were the ones that grew beyond their original objectives. The Vorthon Empire had made a fatal mistake in underestimating both humans and the conquered peoples they had oppressed for so long. They had assumed that superior technology and brutal force would always be enough to maintain control, but they had forgotten that the most powerful weapon in any conflict is the human spirit and the willingness to fight for freedom even against impossible odds. The Ghost Tigers had always specialized in turning enemy strengths into weaknesses, and Taeho had accomplished exactly that. The gladiatorial arenas that were supposed to break the spirits of conquered peoples had instead become training grounds for revolution. The entertainment systems designed to distract and demoralize had become communication networks for coordinating resistance. Most importantly, the Empire's own arrogance and contempt for other species had blinded them to the growing threat until it was too late to stop. The conquered peoples had learned to work together, inspired by the example of one human who had refused to give up. As reports continued to arrive from across the galaxy, it became clear that the Vorthon Empire was facing its greatest crisis in history. The age of easy conquest and brutal oppression was ending, and a new era of freedom and cooperation was beginning. Taeho touched his dog tag one final time and smiled. The mission was complete, and it had succeeded beyond even his wildest expectations. The 707th Special Mission Battalion had struck its most devastating blow not through destruction, but through inspiration.